Good day, everyone. Good day, ma'am. Good day, classmates. So, our report is about the functional notional approach. So, here is my team or my group of mates. It is Valine, Gurley, and I for this report. So, for the merits for this approach, the functional notional syllabuses are of a number of merits which are mainly the major characteristic of this type of syllabus suggested by Finiciaro and Brumfitt in 1983, and these merits can be briefly be viewed from four perspectives. First is from a social-linguistic perspective. The functional notional syllabuses emphasize the communicative purpose of the speech act. As a result, this kind of syllabuses often tries to set fairly realistic language for learners to learn. And this approach intends to offer everyday, real world language use in a variety of social cultural situations. Thus, learners will be introduced not only to grammatical knowledge of the language, but also to the cultural knowledge necessary for them to fully understand the target language and its culture, and it recognizes that the speaker must have a real purpose for speaking and something to talk about. So next is from a psycholinguistic perspective, the functional notional syllabuses have placed the needs of learners at the very core of the teaching program. Consequently, the functional notional syllabus is often arranged according to different levels and needs of the target learners, and it is intrinsically motivating because it provides actual communicative functions to serve the learner's needs, and it understands that before asking learners to produce the language, sufficient input must be provided initially. And thanks to its unit or more modular organization of the curriculum materials, and the courses can be designed in a flexible and modular way, which will enable learners to learn with different rhythm or pace of learning. And from a linguistic perspective, the functional notional syllabuses will help learners at each level to acquire a reasonable basic knowledge of the phonological, grammatical, and the lexical subsystems of the language, as well as the ability to use this in actual communication. And from an educational perspective, the functional notional syllabuses have several other merits too. So the approach has enabled teachers to exploit sound, psycholinguistic, linguistic, and educational principles, and it can be developed naturally from existing teaching methodology. And it enables a spiral curriculum to be used, which reintroduces grammatical, topical, and cultural material. And lastly, it provides for the widespread promotion of foreign language courses. And for the drawbacks of this approach, the above merits are drawn from the ideal level of the functional notional syllabuses. However, the practical application of this kind of syllabuses shows a number of problems, which has aroused criticisms against functional notional syllabuses among the researchers in this field. And the major drawbacks can also be seen from different perspectives. So, from the perspective of of the course design or the application of a functional notional syllabus, the designer always encounter difficulties during the selection of the content. This is because, first, the idea of functions and notions of language is not as clearly definable as it is thought to be. And although there are criteria listed above for the selection and grading of the components of functional notional syllabus, it is hard to decide such as which functions or notions is more coverage or frequency than others. And a need of analysis is an important and necessary step before the design of the contents, as whatever included in any particular functional notional syllabus are highly related to the need of the learners. And however, it is always difficult to carry out a profound need analysis in a real life situation. And from the perspective of the nature of language, the basic assumption of functional notional syllabuses can sometimes be misleading. For firstly, the idea that language is determined by the uses or functions performs is an oversimplistic view, and the communication does not just refer to language functions and notions, and the process of communication somehow remains unstated in this kind of syllabuses. And the functional notional syllabuses, in fact, also assumes that the language can be broken down into discrete components, various functions and notions, and that can be taught separately, and these assumptions makes them not much different from grammatical syllabuses is in misleading the real nature of language. And from the perspective of language teaching and learning, functional notional syllabuses bring along this dissatisfactions and problems and answer to language teachers and learners, such as the grammatical structure. Structures elicited by the functions and notions taught appear in unsystematically order, which may make teachers and learners, especially those familiar with grammatical approach, uncomfortable. And important grammatical structures may not be touched by the functions and notions included in the syllabuses, which may lead to low grammatical competence of the learners. And language functions and notions do not have particular linear sequence, which may make it ineffective for teaching and learning, as the latter is a process inherently sequential in nature. And lastly, for the drawbacks, the functional notional syllabuses are product oriented, which state clearly the expected outcomes of language learning. However, it fails to address the process of how to realize the outcomes. So it is difficult to determine the order in which to teach functions, or what language are students most in need of, and and in what sequence. And students are often required to use language structures with which they are not familiar in order to learn the functional language. This may lead to memorization rather than a full understanding of a structure's form and use. And sometimes the selection of language structures presented appears arbitrary, resulting in possible frustration for logical or linear learners. And dysfunctional language teaching may have shortcomings for advanced students. And how can this method meet the particular needs of a more developed student? So it's up to you in how you will organize this type of approach for, for a guide in making your lesson plan to teach your students. So, in conclusion, language is presented in this kind of approach, language is presented in manageable chunks pertaining to particular functions. So, it can easily be learned, retained, and used. And students are prepared to deal with basic situations and can therefore effectively use the language they have learned in real life situations. And students feel like they are learning something because they feel fluent and competent in the functions they have learned in this type of approach. So that is the conclusion of our report. So thank you everyone.